name is Lisa Hugo, and I'm obsessed with helping other people find and develop their voices so they can go out and take on the world, be seen as an authority, expert, and speak their truth with utmost confidence because they know that what they have to share will connect with their audience and make a difference. I studied performing arts and spent 20 years of my career traveling the world as a professional singer-songwriter. I teach you the secrets to speak up and be heard, overcome your fears, to build your speaking skills, and learn how you can use your skills to make a change both in your own life and the lives of others. This is your one-stop shop for all things confident speaking. This is Impact Through Voice. Well, hey there, and welcome back to the Impact Through Voice podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Hugo, and I'm so grateful that you are tuning in and finding value in this podcast. Now, before we get into the show, I just want to highlight the fact that there are so many of you who are listening to the show, but you haven't yet subscribed. Seriously, it would mean so much to me and to my team if you just simply hit the subscribe button on whatever player you're using to listen to this show. It really helps us to grow the show and reach more people. And it also means you're not going to miss out on an episode. Also, if you leave us a review, go to that extra mile and leave us a review, then you stand the chance to win a private coaching session with me. And if it's a nice review, well, you might even hear me give you a shout out on a future episode. Okay, let's dive in. Did you know that there are some secret techniques that great interviewers use that are rarely discussed publicly? And today, I want to reveal some of those secrets. So in this episode, I'm going to showcase the key skills that are critical for successful interviews, both on stage and on screen. And I'm going to share some techniques to make you a more engaging interviewer. And I'm also going to highlight the differences between on stage and on screen interviews. Now, if you've been following me for any length of time, or you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you're going to know that I've been on stage for most of my life as a singer. I'm also a speaker, a coach, and now I host this podcast. So I've dedicated my career to empowering leaders to harness the power and the potential in their voices. And I've literally helped thousands of people to elevate their communication skills. So I know a thing or two about speaking. And when it comes to interviewing techniques, well, I've been honing my own skills over the past months through this podcast and by listening to other great interviewers. So let me dive in and share some of the secrets that are rarely talked about. Many think that interviewing is just about asking questions, but there is a lot more to it. So I want to start with the basics, the preparation. If you know you have an interview coming up with someone, then you need to do some research. Don't just go into it and wing it. Find all the information that you can about this person. What's their mission? What do they stand for? What are their achievements? What is it that they do which connects with you and your podcast? How does this guest connect with the topic of the interview that you're leading? And I'll share with you one of my top secrets for preparing for an interview with speed and with ease, and that's by using AI. Generally, the people that I'm going to be interviewing will already have an online profile. So that means that I can use something like ChatGPT to help me to find out more about this person. So I'll give ChatGPT a prompt. Hey, this week I'm going to interview this particular person. I'll give their name. And then I'll say, please research this person and share with me all of your findings. So that's the first step. And then ChatGPT will come back with a whole list of information about what they found about that person. And I'll say, great, thanks. Now let's come up with 10 questions that I could ask this person in relation to the topic of our podcast, which is making an impact through voice. So ChatGPT will then give me a series of questions that I could then modify and adjust according to my own direction for the interview. Now, it's not very often that I would use these questions as they're given to me by ChatGPT, but it does give me some inspiration to get started and then rewrite them the way I would like to question, or just to find the right direction and then work on my own questions around those topics. I also binge listen to as much content as I can find from that person, which is then going to trigger my own ideas and the conversations that would be relevant to discuss on my show. Okay, so we've done our research. Let's get into the interview. Now, a great interviewer is intently focused on the guest, and listening skills are then one of the most important skills that an interviewer needs. If you want to be a great interviewer, you need to be immersed in the conversation. You need to be fully present. Don't be ready to just jump in with your next prepared question that you had ready, or you might miss a great opportunity to take the conversation further because you weren't fully immersed in what the person was saying. Make sure that your guest feels comfortable and appreciated. And remember, your guest might be nervous and not experienced in interviews, so you need to set the tone and the pace and make them feel comfortable. Look them in the eye when you're speaking to them. Let them speak without you interrupting. Use paraphrasing so that they know that you were fully present and you understood what they said. John, if I understand you correctly, you said ABC. How did this encourage your decision to move to XYZ? Use follow-up questions to dive deeper into a topic and encourage your guests to elaborate. And then be prepared to veer off the conversation if the topic is still of interest to your audience. So that means you need to be flexible. Don't be so rigid in what you expected to say that you can't move out of that, so that you add more value both to your listeners and also to your guest. All right, let's talk about controlling the pace. Now, as the interviewer, it's your responsibility to keep the interview running smoothly, to make sure that it stays on topic and covers the points that were important and of value. So how do we do that? You start with a few warm-up questions. Get the guest to introduce themselves, to share their story or their journey to get to where they are. And this is going to help them to get comfortable with the setting while they speak about themselves, which should come naturally for them. And it gives the audience a chance to get to know the guest personally. This is then different to your introduction of them. Very different, because it now gets personal. You're introducing them in a formal way, but now they can come in and share their own experience personally. Now, if you need to pull the conversation back because it's drifting off topic, then use some phrases like, let's come back to XYZ. Or, okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Or, oh, I love that. Can we come back to that a little bit later? Now, if you're on a time limit, keep the eye on the timer. If it's an on-camera interview, then the camera technician or the person behind the camera could give you a 10-minute warning alert, for example, when you're getting close to your time. And then if you want to have more prompts, you could ask them to give you more. For example, when you're 15 minutes in, and then when you're 30 minutes in, and then when you're 45 minutes in, they give you a little call out. So they could just hold up their phone with a timer, and then you realize where you are in the interview. Or you could just have a timer running somewhere in the distance where you can see it, and you can keep an eye on where you're at within the interview. Now, it depends. Depending on the type of interview, every so often, it's great to summarize any key points and use them as a bridge to the next topic. For example, you've had a lot of success with X. And that leads me to then wonder about Y. All right, let's move on to body language and eye contact on screen and on stage. But one of the biggest problems that people who are inexperienced at interviewing run into is they don't know where to look, especially if there are multiple cameras in the room. Imagine you're on a TV set and you've got multiple cameras filming different angles, and you might even have an overhead camera on a boom. So this is an entirely different setup. And usually in this kind of a scenario, you're going to also have a producer who's talking to you in your ear, telling you which camera you should be looking at and what you should be saying. So this is an entirely different setup that you would need some extra training on and practice to get used to. So I'm not going to cover that scenario any further in this episode. But let's say that you are recording an on-camera podcast interview, like many of the ones that you will have seen from me on this channel. Well, we generally have 3 cameras or a 3-camera setup. 1 camera for each of the interviewers, or 1 for the interviewer, 1 for the guest. And then we have a center camera for the entire widescreen angle. So when you are introducing your guest to the podcast, then you're usually going to speak to the camera, which is focused only on you. It's like your personal angle. And you'll share the information about the guest that you're about to introduce to that camera. And then when you go to welcome the guest onto the show, that's when you turn to focus to the guest and you begin the interview directly to them, eye contact. You don't necessarily need to ever look back at the camera again unless you're reinforcing a particular point for your listeners. So you turn back to them and say, okay, listeners, did you hear what he said? And then you come back to the guest. Now, I see this mistake all the time when people come onto the show, into the studio, and they feel like they need to speak to the camera during the interview because they're just not comfortable or don't have any experience knowing where to look. And it's really odd if they're talking to you, but they're looking at the camera. It doesn't work. So remember, the conversation is with the interviewer. Make sure that you hold eye contact with them across the room, across the table, across wherever you're seated or however the interview is set up. If you're speaking from stage, it's not really dissimilar. You can use a very similar technique. So the audience is going to be the camera that you would speak to in the case of a podcast. So you'll turn to the audience and you'll introduce the guest to the audience by speaking out to the audience. And then again, when it's time to then introduce that guest, then you turn to the guest and you say, well, welcome, so good to have you here. And you start speaking directly to them. So unless you're highlighting something that was said back to your audience, you don't need to interact with the audience again. But in the case of a stage, then it is good to come back to the audience every so often to wrap up something that they said. Did you get that point? Or that was hilarious. Can you believe he just said that? I recommend that you watch interviews. Like one which comes to mind is My Next Guest Needs No Introduction with David Letterman. Or Oprah Winfrey. She's a master of interviewing, and you can learn so much by watching other great interviewers. And lastly, I want to talk about voice and how you know when your interviewer is finished or when they've got more to say and you shouldn't be butting in yet. When is the right time for you to speak? And it all comes down to the melody in the voice. And when I'm talking about melody, I'm talking about where you speak to the comma and then you speak to the full stop. And what your guest then does with their voice at those commas and full stops. For example, if I ask a guest, hey, which country did you like the most, Jane? And they say, I really liked Singapore. So their voice went down to finish at the full stop. And you can hear that that was their intent. They had no more to say, that they'd finished. But if their voice stayed up, like, I really like Singapore, then this indicates that they've got more to say. So if you would then come in now by cutting them off and say, oh, I really like Singapore. Oh, great. Yeah, I like Singapore too. Then you've cut them off. So they were probably wanting to go on to say something like, I really like Singapore because the people are so friendly and the city is so livable. And now at livable, their voice has gone down, which indicates that they're most likely finished with their sentence, and you could probably come in. So make sure that you listen when your guest drops down at the end of a sentence and wait a fraction of a second to make sure that they really are finished before you respond or you jump in with the next question. Now, another really important reason to wait a fraction of a second after the guest has spoken is to allow time for the audience to absorb the value that your guest has just shared. So if you dive straight in or you talk over them, then you're depriving your audience of the full value that your guest has to share. And you're depriving your guest from really sharing everything they wanted to share. And they might get frustrated. And the audience will get frustrated as well and switch off because they'll realize that you're cutting in. So the whole job about being a good interviewer is to know your guest well, to have an outline for the direction that you want the interview to take, but to be flexible so that you can adjust according to the value that your guest is then giving to your audience. Make sure you are a good listener and you focus on the conversation. So don't be so rigid in your questions that you can't respond to what your guest is saying and ask questions which could be relevant to the direction that the conversation is taking. And if it's going in the wrong direction, then just pull the conversation back while you're still acknowledging all this amazing value that this person is sharing. And then lastly, make sure that you listen to the inflection of the voice of your guest. Make sure that you're aware, are they still talking? Do they still have more to share? Or have they finished what they wanted to say? And you can read that in both their body language and the voice itself. Well, that's it for this episode. I do hope you found it valuable. And if you did and you want to take your interview skills to the next level, we've created a free downloadable guide. We'll put the link down in the show notes or in the description below this video. And then again, if you did find it valuable, then please hit that subscribe button. And even better, go and leave us a review. All right, my friends, I'll see you in the next episode.
Congratulations, you've just finished another episode of Impact Through Voice. You're well on your way to making a positive impact in the world with your voice. If you want more, head on over to lisahugo.com/podcast for show notes and all the links that we mentioned in this episode. Until next time.